The studio was alive with the hum of anticipation, though to the average viewer watching at home, all that could be seen was a polished stage and two chairs placed under immaculate lighting. Off camera, there had been a whisper of nervous energy. Something about Keanu Reeves always seemed to electrify the atmosphere. Unlike most celebrities who came and went with rehearsed lines and a practiced smile, Keanu had the unnerving ability to disrupt the expected rhythm of a talk show. The crew knew it, the audience felt it, and even the host, seasoned and confident, couldn't quite steady her heartbeat as the cameras began rolling. The audience applauded wildly as Keanu entered, clad in a dark tailored suit that still felt unpolished in its simplicity, his long hair framing a face that carried both wariness and wisdom. He greeted the crowd with a small bow, smiled warmly, and sat down. What was supposed to be a light-hearted evening chat about his latest film and personal journey was about to turn into something else entirely. Something no one, not even Keanu himself, seemed fully prepared for. The conversation started predictably. The host leaned in with easy charisma, asking about stunts, the pressures of Hollywood, and his quiet reputation as the kindest man in showbiz. Keanu responded as he always did, humble, soft-spoken, his answers laced with humor and reflection. The audience laughed at his dry wit, sighed at his sincerity, and clung to every word. Yet beneath his calm exterior, something in his eyes gave him away, a distant flicker, a weight pressing against the edges of his composure. The host noticed it too. She tilted her head, sensing an opportunity to steer the interview into more profound territory. "You've always been described as spiritual, grounded, even philosophical," she began, her tone slower now, deliberate. "You've spoken about loss, compassion, and the mysteries of life. I have to ask, when it comes to faith and leadership, what are your thoughts on Pope Francis and the Vatican today?" Her words echoed through the studio, settling into an uneasy silence. The question hadn't been scripted. Producers shifted in their chairs behind the glass, one of them mouthing, "What is she doing?" But it was too late. The question was out, hanging between them like a lit fuse waiting for a spark. Keanu's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but the camera caught it, his shoulders straightening, his jaw tightening. The air in the room seemed to thin, and the vibrant energy of the show melted into an almost sacred hush. For a moment, he didn't speak. His fingers tapped lightly against his knee, and his gaze dropped to the floor as though he was weighing whether to respond at all. The host, sensing she might have gone too far, tried to soften the silence. "Of course, you don't have to answer that if it's too personal," but before she could finish, Keanu raised his head. His eyes, usually so warm, now burned with an intensity that froze her in place. "No," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'll answer." The audience shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. The cameraman instinctively zoomed closer, filling the screen with the quiet storm gathering on Keanu's face. Whatever he was about to say, it wasn't going to be the polished, diplomatic response they were expecting. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, as though confiding in the millions of people who would be watching at home. His words were deliberate, carved from some deep well of conviction. "There's something about Pope Francis that people don't know," Keanu said, his tone steady but heavy with implication. "Something that the world needs to hear." Gasps rippled through the audience like a wave. The host blinked, her carefully rehearsed composure faltering for the first time. She darted a glance at the producers, who were gesturing wildly for her to move on, to cut to commercial, anything but this. But she couldn't. She was rooted to her chair, transfixed by the gravity in Keanu's voice. He wasn't joking. He wasn't performing. This wasn't the rehearsed mystique of an actor playing coy with a secret. This was a man who had carried something for too long, and now, under the unblinking lights of live television, was ready to release it. The studio audience was no longer breathing, the silence so thick it pressed against the walls. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to fade as all eyes locked on the man at the center of the storm, preparing to shatter the image of one of the most powerful figures in the world. For a moment, Keanu sat there, his silence louder than any words could have been. The cameras captured every detail, the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, the glint of something unspoken in his eyes, the subtle rise and fall of his chest as he drew in a deep breath. The audience leaned forward collectively, as though pulled by an invisible force. Even those watching from their living rooms would later describe that pause as unbearable, the kind of silence that told you the next sentence would change everything. Finally, Keanu spoke. His voice was low, deliberate, as though each syllable weighed 1,000 pounds. "Pope Francis," he began, pausing again, letting the name settle over the room like a shadow, "is not the man you think he is." The words cracked through the silence like thunder. A murmur erupted from the crowd, sharp intakes of breath, shocked whispers spreading like wildfire. The host's mouth parted slightly, but no sound came. Her producers, now pale-faced behind the glass, waved frantically, motioning her to redirect, to interrupt, to save the show from derailing. But she couldn't. She was locked into the moment, as powerless as everyone else in the room to stop what was unfolding. Keanu's tone grew heavier, sharper, as though a dam had broken inside him and the flood was no longer containable. Behind the robes, behind the carefully crafted image of humility and compassion, there's a truth that has been hidden for decades. He let the words hang, his gaze sweeping across the audience, daring them to look away. No one did. Not a single cough, not a shuffle of movement, just raw, unfiltered silence. He leaned closer to the host, who instinctively drew back as though the weight of his words carried a physical force. "I know," Keanu continued, his voice edged with something between sorrow and anger, "because I've seen it." Gasps rippled again, sharper this time. Someone in the audience whispered, "What is he saying?" loud enough to be caught faintly by a microphone. The host's hands trembled beneath the desk, her practiced poise collapsing under the enormity of the moment. She swallowed hard, finding her voice. "Keanu, are you saying you have personal knowledge of something hidden about the Pope?" Her voice cracked mid-sentence. He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said flatly, the finality in his tone cutting off any possibility of retreat. The word landed like a hammer against stone. The energy in the room shifted violently. Audience members exchanged wide-eyed glances, some covering their mouths, others leaning forward as though proximity would reveal the truth faster. A producer off-stage gestured wildly at a stagehand to prepare a commercial break, but even they hesitated, knowing to cut now would ignite a storm larger than they could contain. Keanu's eyes darkened, and for the first time, his voice rose, not in anger, but in urgency, the urgency of a man who had carried too long the burden of silence. "People deserve to know," he declared, his words ringing against the walls of the studio. "The Vatican has built walls to keep secrets, but truth has a way of seeping through cracks. And once you've seen behind the curtain, you can never unsee it." The host stammered, "Keanu, this is live television. Are you sure you want to say?" But he cut her off, his voice sharp, commanding, "The question isn't if I should. The question is why no one else has." That line, delivered with absolute conviction, would later be replayed endlessly across social media, dissected on news outlets, and quoted in headlines worldwide. At that moment, the audience erupted, not in applause, but in chaotic murmurs, disbelief mixing with curiosity, shock intertwining with dread. As the frenzy unfolded, the host tried desperately to rein in control, but the narrative had already shifted. Keanu's revelation wasn't just a passing comment, it was a declaration, a spark thrown into a field of dry grass. The tension became suffocating, almost unbearable. You could feel the divide within the room itself. Half the audience clinging to his words as though he were speaking prophecy, the other half recoiling, fearful of what might come next. Keanu, unflinching, sat upright, his gaze steady, his voice unwavering. "I won't sit here," he said, "and pretend not to know what I know. There comes a time when silence is betrayal, and I won't betray the truth any longer." That single sentence, delivered live, raw, and without hesitation, was the matchstick. The studio gasped collectively, the host's eyes widened in disbelief, and somewhere in the control room, a producer screamed, "Cut the feed." But the cameras didn't cut. The world was already listening, and Keanu Reeves had just cracked open a door the Vatican had spent decades trying to keep sealed shut. The studio had become a battlefield of silence and chaos, two opposing forces clashing invisibly in the air. On one side, the audience, half spellbound, half horrified, hung on to every syllable as though history itself was unfolding in real time. On the other side, the production team scrambled frantically, their voices rising in panic behind the glass booth, their gestures wild and desperate. The host sat in the middle of it all, frozen in place, her eyes locked on Keanu with a mixture of dread and fascination. She could feel it. This wasn't the safe, rehearsed world of television anymore. Something had cracked, something raw and uncontrollable had slipped through, and now she was powerless to stop it. "Keanu," she began again, her voice trembling as though she were speaking on behalf of every nervous producer. You must realize the weight of what you're saying. If this is true, then—" But Keanu raised a hand, silencing her instantly. His gesture was neither aggressive nor dismissive, but it carried the authority of a man who had already decided he would not be stopped. "Truth doesn't care about weight," he said calmly, his voice ringing out like a verdict. "It just exists, whether people are ready for it or not." The audience erupted in whispers, some visibly unsettled, others nodding as though they had been waiting for someone, anyone, to say aloud what they themselves had only dared to suspect. A young man in the front row muttered, "He's brave, he's crazy, but he's brave." Others shook their heads, whispering prayers under their breath. Suddenly, one of the producers burst onto the stage, headset tangled, face flushed with panic. He gestured wildly at the host, mouthing the word, "commercial." "No." The cameras caught the intrusion, and millions of viewers at home saw the chaos firsthand. But instead of retreating, Keanu leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and shook his head. "You can try to silence me," he said, loud enough for the microphones to catch, "but you can't silence the truth. Not forever." His words landed like gunfire. The producer froze, realizing that to drag Keanu off stage would not only confirm suspicion but ignite an even greater scandal. Reluctantly, he retreated, disappearing behind the curtains, his hands in his hair. The host swallowed hard, trying to regain control, but her voice cracked as she asked, "So, what happens now?" Keanu looked around the studio, his gaze sweeping across the faces that stared back at him. He wasn't angry. If anything, there was sorrow in his expression, as though the burden of what he carried was heavier than anyone realized. "What happens now," he said softly, "is up to the people. You've heard me. You can dismiss it, you can call me a liar, you can attack me. Or you can start asking the questions you should have been asking all along." The crowd stirred again, voices rising in a cacophony of disbelief and agreement. Some shouted, "Tell us more," while others stood abruptly, shaking their heads, muttering as they stormed out of the studio. The divide was tangible now, supporters and skeptics splitting the room in two. The cameras captured it all. The tears, the outrage, the desperate cries for more clarity. The host, overwhelmed, sat speechless as her audience, her carefully curated live audience, began to fracture before her very eyes. Then it happened, the walkout. A middle-aged man in a suit stood up suddenly from the third row, his face red with fury. "This is blasphemy," he shouted, his voice booming across the studio. "How dare you slander the Holy Father on live television?" He turned sharply, storming up the aisle toward the exit. Others followed, some in anger, some in fear, some because the weight of the moment was simply too much to bear. One by one, groups of people rose from their seats, their footsteps echoing against the studio floor as they walked out. The cameras caught every angle, the disbelief on their faces, the trembling of their hands, the heated arguments breaking out among the audience themselves. Yet for every person who left, another stayed rooted to their chair, unmoving, unwilling to miss what might come next. By the time the doors slammed shut, the studio had been split almost perfectly in half. One side emptied by outrage, the other still locked in a silence so deep it bordered on reverence. Keanu watched it all unfold without flinching. His face was unreadable, though the faintest trace of sadness flickered in his eyes as the sound of the doors echoed through the studio. "This is what truth does," he murmured, almost to himself. "It divides before it unites. It shatters before it rebuilds." His words, spoken softly, carried across the fractured audience, searing themselves into the memory of everyone who remained. The host, overwhelmed, finally managed to whisper, "Keanu, do you understand what you've just done?" He turned to her, his expression calm, resolute. "Yes," he replied, his voice firm, "and I would do it again." With that, he leaned back in his chair, hands folded in his lap, as though daring the world to challenge him further. The cameras captured his stillness, the storm raging all around him, and beamed it into millions of homes. The walkout had changed everything. This was no longer just an interview. It was history unfolding in real time, and the name Keanu Reeves was now forever linked to a revelation that could not be contained. The studio was split down the middle, half empty from a walkout, half frozen in a tense, almost reverent silence. The host sat rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her desk. Sweat glistened at her temple under the hot lights, but her eyes never left Keanu. The camera zoomed closer, sensing what everyone in the room already knew. The next words out of his mouth would define not just this interview, but perhaps the legacy of the man sitting across from her. Keanu drew in a long, deliberate breath. His gaze swept the studio, settling momentarily on the audience that remained. Their faces told a story of their own, some pale with shock, others burning with curiosity, a few trembling with hope that they might finally hear the truth they had long suspected but never dared voice. "You asked me about Pope Francis," Keanu began, his voice calm but weighted, like a man carrying a cross invisible to everyone else. "And I told you there was something the world didn't know. Tonight, I won't keep that secret any longer." The host opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She sat back in her chair, her body stiff with anticipation, her heart pounding so loudly she swore the microphones could pick it up. Keanu's voice grew steadier, more commanding, as though some unseen force had taken root in his chest and was guiding the words out of him. "Pope Francis is celebrated as a man of compassion, a man of humility, a symbol of renewal for the Catholic Church. But behind that image lies a truth that very few have been allowed to see. A truth I stumbled upon not by choice, but by circumstance." He paused, his eyes darkening, his voice lowering into something almost confessional. "Years ago, I was invited to Rome. I thought it was just a private audience, an honor, a chance to meet the man the world called holy. But what I witnessed, it was something else entirely." The audience leaned in, their bodies taut with tension, as if a wire had been strung through every chest and Keanu was slowly tightening it. "I walked into those chambers expecting faith. What I saw was power. Cold, unflinching power, masked in robes and smiles." The words struck like lightning, and a ripple of gasps swept across the room. The host raised a trembling hand to her lips, her eyes wide. "Keanu," she whispered, "are you saying—" But he didn't let her finish. "I'm saying," he continued, his tone sharp now, cutting through the room like a blade, "that Pope Francis is not the man the world thinks he is, and the Vatican is not the sanctuary people believe it to be." The effect was immediate and explosive. Audience members clutched their seats, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others gripping the hands of strangers as though they were bracing against a storm. A woman in the second row whispered a frantic prayer, her lips moving silently, tears welling in her eyes. A man further back muttered, I knew it, as though confirmation of his suspicions justified a lifetime of doubt. The host's carefully crafted mask of professionalism had crumbled completely now. Her voice cracked as she asked, What exactly did you see?" The question hung in the air, heavy and trembling. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, as though the memory itself weighed him down, then opened them again with a look that made the entire room shiver. "I saw men who talk of God but live for control. I saw a system that feeds on secrecy, that thrives on fear, that silences anyone who dares to speak out. And I saw Pope Francis at the center of it all, not as the servant of the people he claims to be, but as a man playing a role carefully orchestrated to protect an empire built on lies." The room exploded, not in noise, but in energy. The air was electric, trembling, alive with the magnitude of what had just been spoken aloud. Some in the audience clutched their chests, others stood in disbelief, and still others shouted out, demanding answers, demanding proof. The host's voice rose above the chaos, breaking with desperation. "Keanu, do you understand what you're saying? These are accusations against one of the most powerful institutions in the world." Keanu's eyes snapped to hers, steady and unwavering. "They're not accusations," he said firmly, his tone sharp and unyielding. "They're the truth. And I've stayed silent long enough." He leaned forward, his face inches from the camera now, as though speaking directly to the millions watching from their living rooms. "If you think faith is about blind obedience, you're wrong. If you think truth belongs to an institution, you're wrong. The truth belongs to all of us. And no robe, no throne, no title can ever change that." For a heartbeat, the studio froze, time itself holding its breath. The cameras captured Keanu in perfect stillness, his expression carved with conviction, his words echoing into the silence like the toll of a church bell. And then, chaos. The remaining half of the audience erupted, some cheering, some shouting in protest, some crying openly. The host sat frozen, her body shaking, her mind spinning as the enormity of the moment swallowed her whole. In the control room, producers screamed into headsets, demanding the feed be cut, demanding the broadcast end. But it was too late. The big reveal had already been spoken, carried across satellites and screens, reaching millions of ears, searing itself into millions of minds. Keanu Reeves had done the unthinkable. He had pulled back the curtain on one of the most revered figures on Earth, and the world would never look at Pope Francis or the Vatican the same way again. The studio was no longer a place of order and spectacle. It had dissolved into chaos. Shouts clashed with sobs, the heavy scrape of chairs against the floor punctuating the air as more audience members rose in outrage. The host, pale and trembling, looked utterly powerless, her hands spread helplessly on the desk before her. She had lost control of her show, her audience, and perhaps even her career. The producers screamed orders into headsets, their voices rising with desperation. Cut the feed. Kill the cameras. End it now. But the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second as if fate itself had locked them into place. And in the eye of the storm sat Keanu Reeves, silent, steady, though the flicker in his eyes betrayed a different story. His revelation had been volcanic, impossible to contain once it erupted, but as the storm raged around him, the first seeds of doubt began to take root in his mind. He had spoken the truth, yes, but was the world ready to carry it? Or had he just ignited a fire that would consume not only him but everyone around him? Security entered the studio, weaving their way through the chaos, but they hesitated. How do you escort away a man like Keanu Reeves, beloved by millions, respected even by those who didn't believe him? One guard hovered near the stage, uncertain, glancing between his orders and the star sitting calmly in the chair. The audience fractured further, some yelling for Keanu to be silenced, others pleading for him to go on, still others filming on their phones, determined to capture history for themselves before the network tried to erase it. The host leaned forward, her voice breaking. "Keanu, please stop. You don't understand. There are consequences for this. Real consequences." Her words trembled with fear, and for a moment, Keanu's mask of resolve cracked. He saw her not as a host, not as a representative of the network, but as a person, terrified, caught in the crossfire of something much larger than herself. For the first time since he had begun speaking, he looked down, his fingers curling into his palms. A storm of emotion played behind his eyes, conviction, sorrow, and, buried beneath it all, the creeping shadow of regret. The noise in the room seemed to stretch, to distort. Every cheer, every angry cry, every plea felt like an echo from another world. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time that evening, he looked vulnerable. The weight of his words pressed back against him, heavier now, no longer liberating but crushing. "What have I done?" he whispered, barely audible, but the nearest microphones caught it, projecting it into the stunned silence that rippled suddenly through the studio. His voice was not triumphant, not defiant, but fragile, haunted. The words sliced through the noise like a blade, and for a moment, the chaos stilled. The audience fell quiet, even those who had shouted most loudly. The host leaned toward him, her voice soft now, almost maternal. "Keanu, it's not too late. Maybe you don't have to carry this alone." Her words, intended to comfort, instead drove the realization deeper. Alone. That was what he had always been. That was what he would remain. For all the millions who adored him, who respected his humility and his strength, in this moment of seismic consequence, Keanu Reeves was utterly, painfully alone. Producers finally made the call, and the live broadcast cut abruptly to commercial. Millions of viewers at home blinked at their screens, confusion and disbelief spreading like a virus. Social media erupted instantly. Clips ripped from live streams spread across platforms, the words Keanu and Pope flooding feeds worldwide within minutes. But inside the studio, as the cameras went dark, the silence felt like a tomb. Keanu rose slowly from his chair, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the stage. Security hovered closer now, not to drag him away, but to escort him gently, almost protectively, from the chaos. The host sat frozen, her eyes wide with a cocktail of fear, sympathy, and disbelief. As Keanu moved toward the exit, his face hardened again, but the flicker of regret in his eyes betrayed him. He had spoken truth, but in the echo of his words, he felt the enormity of the world's reaction pressing down on him. The cost was no longer theoretical. It was real. His career, his reputation, his peace, all of it now hung in the balance. Outside the studio, the night air hit him like a wall, cool, sharp, and sobering. Flashbulbs exploded as paparazzi and reporters swarmed, their voices a blur of questions. "Keanu, what did you mean? Do you have proof? Are you afraid of retaliation?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His lips pressed into a thin line, his silence louder than words. Somewhere deep in his chest, the regret gnawed at him like a relentless tide. The truth had been freed, but the cost of that freedom was yet to be counted. And in that instant, as the noise of the world closed in around him, Keanu Reeves realized the most haunting truth of all. Sometimes, revealing what lies in the shadows doesn't bring light, it only deepens the darkness.